Well, I didn't realize it, but I had not made an update here on the YouTube channel since sometime in May. Actually, a lot has happened since then. I just haven't made any updates on it. So let me kind of give you a rundown of what happened. Part of it is because of some personal stuff that went on. I've been out of town twice to go visit my son and my daughter-in-law and my now 2 grandchildren, because I welcomed another one into the world this summer. So yay for me, double grandpa, and I'm not even 50 yet. The benefits of getting married kind of young and having a son who did the same thing. But that is part of what kind of derailed me from making updates and kind of generally being engaged, I guess, with the hobby. And I also had another hobby kind of surge to the front of my interest and spent a couple months there. And now I've had yet another hobby that I'm kind of also spending time on. So I haven't done as much with the role-playing stuff as I was doing back in May, but there is actually quite a bit of stuff that I did that I haven't yet told you about, and I kind of want to get involved with it right now and tell you a little bit about it. When last I posted a YouTube video to this channel on this topic, I had made a map and I was talking about making some minor modifications or trying to figure out exactly where to go with it. Like, is this going to be it, or do I want to make another iteration of it, or what do I want to do? And what I decided is actually, I think, a little bit interesting. So this one is a good kind of reference for the setting overall. But what I did is I whipped up 3 different campaign briefs. And this would be a campaign proposal that I would give to, potentially a group and say, hey, do you want to do this, or do you want to do this, or do you want to do this third option? And each one is centered, at least as it starts, on a slightly different area of the map. And I don't know that I necessarily would stay there. Part of the way that I run campaigns is that I don't plan too far ahead. But each of these campaign briefs, however, does kind of have a tone, a theme, an area, and kind of the beginnings of a plot. And I don't mean the plot as in, the plot of a novel or a movie. I mean plots as in there are people plotting, and the PCs would be created in such a way that they would have reasons to get involved in that, and then we see what happens from there. So I wrote these 3 campaign briefs, and what I decided is that for each campaign, I would draw a campaign map, and it would draw from the main map as a reference, but it wouldn't necessarily try to slavishly imitate it. It would use it as a reference, but it would be customized for that particular campaign. And if it turns out that in one of these campaigns, an area is kind of distorted or bent or slightly rearranged from how it is on the reference map, that's fine. And I'm going to do a kind of Schrodinger's canon, if you will, and I'm not going to say that one is more canonical to the setting than another interpretation. The campaign maps are canonical for that campaign. They would not be necessarily canonical for another campaign, even if it overlapped geographically. So that's kind of where I'm thinking of going, and that means that I would have to draw 3 new maps. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. So for one of the campaign briefs, I kind of had a few specific areas that would come into play. If I were to draw a map specifically for this campaign, it would be extremely long and narrow, kind of like the state of Tennessee, if you will. And because, it would be very impractical for me to draw a map that was that long and skinny, I would probably distort some of the features on the map and make it a little bit fatter, so to speak, north to south, and it would fit differently. So that one would look a little bit different. And then another map, based on one of the other campaign briefs, would kind of focus on a different area, and it would look different. And that would be, like I said, each campaign would have its own map, would be canon for that campaign, even if they didn't align with each other. Now, if I don't ever do campaigns, this would also work for a novella or novel, even if were I to write one, or something else, utilizing the campaign setting. So I kind of like this approach where I would draw multiple maps that are more detailed than the basic map, use the basic map as a reference, but are specific to a campaign, novel, story, whatever the project ends up being. I'm calling them campaigns because by default I think of these as role-playing campaigns, but I might end up doing something else with these briefs instead, especially considering that my old group has completely dried up and blown away in the wind, and I have not been super motivated to try and find another one yet. Needless to say, I still think of this as a role-playing project rather than like a novel writing project or something like that. So so that's kind of where that is. I actually drew out about 80% of the first of these campaign maps, and I realized that I just hated the way one of the features looked, so I pulled out some liquid paper. Little did I know this liquid paper was very old, so it was kind of a little dried up and chunky, and it also had kind of turned a weird bluish color. So when I applied it, it just looked really terrible, and it kind of smudged some other stuff too. And it's like, I kind of screwed this map up, and it's a real shame because I'd spent about 3 or 4 hours, well, 2 or 3 hours working on it, and now I am unhappy with it and I have to start over. So I kind of lost my momentum on drawing the map, and then I had to go out of town, and that's how it goes. I haven't gotten back to that yet. So I haven't drawn any of these maps, but I do have the campaign briefs, and I will turn them into maps here probably in the next few weeks. I do want to talk a little bit about campaign briefs, and these campaign briefs in particular, and then maybe even show them to you and read them to you even. I have a few rules about campaign briefs, and by rules I just kind of mean guidelines for myself so that I make them as effective as possible. And these aren't necessarily hard and fast rules, and I can see situations where I might bend or break them, but for the most part this is what I want my campaign briefs to be. And these are basically one-pagers that you give to the players before the game starts. And in this case, I have 3 of them, and I'd give all 3 of them to them and say, read them all and, talk about it, vote, or whatever it is you want to do, and pick one and tell me which one we're going to run, or which one I'm going to run for you, because I would be happy running any of the 3, and they get to choose which of the 3 sounds the best to them. So the first rule of writing an effective one-pager campaign brief, and I kind of alluded to it already, one-pager. Keep it short. I've actually always had this rule, even when I was making campaign briefs for 3rd edition D&D, but I didn't keep it that short back then because it was a much less rules light system, and I had a lot of house rules. I had to spend the better part of the page just explaining the house rules. So here I've decided that no matter what, these campaign briefs are a single page. And they can't be super dense either, like tiny font and no margins. It's a single page that you can read in a few minutes. And that's enough to get you going. Rule number 2, give them some setting context. So the 5th edition books, the setting books, have about half a dozen or so dot points bullet points that summarize the setting. I actually don't really like the bullet point system. I think it makes it feel like a PowerPoint from some boring work meeting. And I think a more elegant and civilized way to do it is to write some text that has a similar ring to it as the opening crawl of Star Wars. You don't need nearly as many details as you think. Star Wars starts with a couple of sentences, two or three short paragraphs that are extremely short, and that gives you enough context to then immediately jump into the action. And I think that that's true with my campaign briefs as well. You don't need as much setting context as you think, especially if your setting isn't some, really kind of bizarre thing. If you're running a fantasy, a space opera, something where most of the tropes are going to be familiar, then you can kind of assume that they'll figure it out as you go. The 3rd rule, tell them what you expect the PCs to do. Now, I don't mean specifically what they're going to do, but I mean kind of what their role is going to be. If you're going to be doing the Fantasy X-Files, for example, which is something that I often consider my games to be like, then you basically want to tell your players that you're going to be the fantasy version of Mulder and Scully. If you're going to be, doing something else, tell them that. It doesn't have to be complicated, and it certainly doesn't need to be something where you're telling them this is what you have to do. But it does kind of mean this is kind of the theme of the campaign, and this is the role that I see for the PCs. And exactly what you do with that role is obviously up to you, but this is what the campaign is going to be about. The next rule, give the players some options to choose from as they create characters. And I don't mean stuff like races and classes, although maybe that applies, especially if they're going to be different from standard. I mean something else that kind of gives them something to sink their teeth into with regards to the setting. You'll see what I did with the 3 examples I have here. For example, one of them there's a list of patrons that they can choose from that they either work for or they're, for whatever reason, they're kind of this patron's agent in some way or another. For another one, I have the campaign starts off at a funeral, and you choose how your character was related or how he knew this guy who died. So, it's something that is kind of has some immediacy that they can sink their teeth into so they feel a connection to the setting. And you kind of have to give that to them because there's no way that the players will know that ahead of time if you don't give them some options. And actually, if you give them options, that might be sufficient for them to create alternatives with your approval, because in seeing the example options you gave them, then they know what kind of stuff would work. And the final rule, set some expectations on tone, theme, gameplay style, just so you don't have a mismatch and disappointed players, or disappointed you because they're trying to do something different than what you're wanting to do. So if the players are, for example, showing up expecting a bright and polite brony themed fairy tale, and they end up getting served Call of Cthulhu and Fantasy Drag, there's a serious mismatch between expectation and reality, and probably everybody's going to be disappointed. I know personally I would be disappointed if my players ever wanted to do anything brony themed, but that's neither here nor there. If you're expecting to run them through a hex crawl sandbox and they're expecting lead through the nose adventure path, that's another serious mismatch of expectations. So you kind of need to lay that out and just explain very briefly what the campaign is going to be like so that you can be on the same page. So other than that, before you start, I used to favor the idea of the session zero, and I used to favor that in part because I used to use much more complicated rule systems. I no longer favor that because I think that what I would have done in a session zero can be done in less than an hour with the systems that I use now. So there's no point in having a separate session for that. You do it in your first session, then you take a break after you're done with that, and then you jump immediately into play, and maybe you even roll for initiative right away. So that's another thing that I've kind of changed, because I feel like it's important to kind of jump into the action right away. I used to also favor expecting my players to know a lot of rules. I now no longer require them, or I would never lay out the expectation that I require them to know all the rules. In part because the system is very simple. I feel like they can know the rules if they want. I'm not trying to hide the rules from them. But if they don't feel motivated to go read my rules document, and even then they only need to read like 20-25 pages of it, because the rest of it after that is GM stuff, monster lists, spell lists, stuff like that. They can read it if they want. And actually, I'd be happy if they do. I hope that they all would, but if they don't want to, if they feel intimidated by reading a new rule book or whatever, then they don't have to. And I don't require that, and I could easily run the game for them without it. So one of the advantages of the rules light paradigm that I follow. I do like the idea of everybody building their characters together, even though I don't do session zero. I think I would probably discourage people from trying to read the rules and build characters before they come. Kind of a funny quirk of mine is that I have a really hard time with what is a common assumption that people need to build a balanced party or else they're going to fail. I absolutely reject that idea. I think it's borderline passive-aggressive of GMs to say you have to build the party a certain way or else you will fail. I think it is the GM's responsibility to give players the freedom to create the characters they want to create. That is one of the few areas where they have kind of just absolute sovereignty, in my opinion. And so they should make the characters they want to create. And if you get everybody of the same class or the same race or whatever, then it's your job as GM to figure out how to make that game work for them, and not to kind of, like I said, passively aggressively punish them for not doing something that you thought they should do. I think that is a complete failure. But regardless, even though I have that idea, and I recognize that that's not necessarily a common idea, not a lot of GMs probably think that or even think about it, to be honest with you, I still feel like most people prefer building their characters with an idea of what else the other guys are doing. And even if it is because they specifically do want to be all the same race and class, either way, they want to know what everybody else is doing so they can kind of be on the same page about how we're building characters. So I think that that's an important thing for them to be able to do together. It's worth pointing out at this point that The Dark Heritage rules that I use, that I wrote, in fact, borrow a little exercise that comes out of Fate. It's a rules light kind of system which creates, and it's a very brief exercise, only takes 5 minutes or so if people are on the ball. And it creates links between the characters. So rather than being just random strangers who meet in a tavern, they're people who have backstory, brief backstory, but important, with at least a couple other characters, so that when they're all together, they kind of have a reason to adventure. They have stuff that they can refer to in the past. It's a great role-playing hook, and it's also, for me, I think it's important to build the verisimilitude that we're not making concessions to the fiction of the game. And to some degree, you have to make some concessions to the fiction of the game. And there's a lot of things that people kind of joke about and laugh about, like, oh, we all meet in the tavern and you look trustworthy, so 30 seconds into this job interview, let's take you, you're on, you join, and people run into other player characters in random places because another player character died, and so you had to replace them. I like to try and find ways to mitigate that so it's not so blatantly obvious that you're doing that. This exercise kind of gives a little bit of that, and it's in the rules. You can go look at the rules and read them yourself if you're interested. Anyway, that being said, let's have a look at my campaign briefs, and I have 3 of them. The first one is called Chaos in Waychester, and it starts off with my Star Wars crawl. It is a time of civil war. The Grand Duke of Waychester has imprisoned his own wife in the highest tower. The nobility that favor her over her husband have retreated to their country estates to plot their next moves, and the Ladies' Guard have become desperate and dangerous outlaws. Accusations from the Grand Duke that she is guilty of the most vile witchcraft have inflamed the passions of the common people against her. Mobs are in the streets every day and riots are common. The countryside is inflamed with anti-nobility sentiment. Travel in the area is dangerous and tense. The Lord Mayor of the rival city-state of Dunsbury in the south is breathing a sigh of relief. The Grand Duke had made clear his intention of annexing, by force if necessary, the entire hill country area and promoting himself to king. His troubles at home will end that ambition, at least for a time. You are traveling northwards from Dunsbury. Your mission is to determine what to make of the chaos in Waychester. Is there a supernatural threat in the form of the Grand Duchess or her allies? Is there a political threat in the form of the Grand Duke to the land southward? The fate of the entire hill country hangs in the balance of events happening now, and you are to be at the center of them. All right, and then that's that, and then we start into the next section of my brief. The game will be played using the Dark Heritage 2 M20 rules. Hardcore mode optional rules will not be used. No customized races are allowed. There are no other house rules in effect. Characters may pick any race or class from the book, and we will create level 1 characters at the first session together and then jump right in. If you don't know the rules, they're not that hard. I can walk you through it as we play. It is expected that the first leg of the game will take place solely in the hill country region of the setting. This is a frontier area like the Old West, if it had been settled by Robin Hood-era British. The northern half of the hill country is under the control of Waychester and its Grand Duke Edmund Rewald. Waychester is the major city, but a number of other towns, trading posts, villages, and hamlets rely on the strength of Waychester for protection. The southern half of the hill country looks for protection to the less hierarchical government of the Lord Mayor of Dunsbury. You will begin play en route from Dunsbury to Waychester. Your characters might all be here with slightly different goals depending on their patron. You may pick patrons from the following list, and that will have some impact on the game early on. If you wish, everyone can pick the same patron, or you can pick different ones. Lord Anstel Tane. This middle-aged noble is a Waychester native, but has been living in exile in Dunsbury for a decade and a half. He was once engaged to the Grand Duchess before her involvement with the Grand Duke made that impossible, and he had to flee a bad political situation. He is desperate to know what is happening with her, and if she is in need of rescue from the Grand Duke or his subjects. Numus Seleucus, a representative of a powerful trading syndicate from Lomar in the north that has a great deal of money tied up in Waychester, is concerned about its investment, including bribes to the Grand Duke for prime land on which to build a caravansary and dock on the Darkling Sea. Rumors are that in the chaos, the Grand Duke may seize all lands not already under the control of his allies. Seleucus will pay handsomely to protect the syndicate's investment. Sir Lyamond Relly. The Hill Country Rangers are not loyal to either of the two rival city-states, but rather directly to the people of the Hill Country. Sir Relly represents the rare and secretive Shadow Division of the Rangers, who concern themselves with supernatural threats. He has credible reports of suspicious and dangerous activity in Waychester, But contrary to the reports of the Grand Duke, he's not so sure that the rumors of their nature are true, or if some other source is to blame for the shady goings-on in Waychester. Lord Captain Embrick Stane, a retired commander of the Ladies' Guard, the Grand Duchess's personal paramilitary organization, Lord Captain Stane is still hale enough to wield a sword, and along with some of his other compatriots living quietly in Dunsbury, is considering a dramatic return to active duty to save Waychester from itself. However, given the rumors and what he knows of both the Grand Duke and his wife, he's not sure which of the two of them it needs saving from, and is hoping your report can convince his forces which way to throw their weight if they decide to enter the fray. The themes of this campaign will include intrigue, horror, investigation, and swashbuckling action. Imagine a combination of supernatural horror and fantasy with no doubt a fair bit of dry gallows humor, not unlike the Brendan Fraser Mummy movie, combined with a fantasy Jason Bourne movie in tone. This is not a pre-written campaign, so your choices will derive the direction that it goes, and elements of your character's design and background are expected to play an important role. The second campaign brief is Cult of Undeath. An old friend and mentor is dead. Professor Alpin Letchfield, formerly of the Mittermarkt Academy, has died in a strange accident under circumstances that are suspicious. His research into strange, forbidden knowledge on behalf of the Academy means that folks are gathering like vultures to see if they can pick through his inheritance for secrets best left uncovered. His young daughter, Rebecca, his only living family, is expected to inherit the lion's share of his estate, but you have also been named as heirs and asked to gather for the funeral and reading of the will. The missive that summoned you also requests that you stay at the estate for a brief interval, not only to receive your portion of the inheritance, but also to protect the interest of his daughter from foul interference. Dark clouds gather over Professor Letchfield's estate as you arrive, as well as the nearby village of Cockrell's Hill, and suspicious and hostile eyes all turn to the arriving strangers like yourself who are making their way into town. The game will be played using the Dark Heritage 2 M20 rules. Hardcore mode optional rules will not be used and no custom races are allowed. There are no other house rules in effect. Characters may pick any race or class from the book, and we will create level 1 characters at the first session together, and then jump right in. If you don't know the rules, they're not that hard, and I can walk you through it as we play. It is expected that the first leg of the game will take place solely in the hill country region of the setting. This is a frontier area like the Old West if it had been settled by Robin Hood-era British. Professor Letchfield lives on a country estate far from any major urban settlement, but the mining and farming community of Cockrell's Hill is near his estate, and a network of connected towns and villages, all within a fairly easy ride from Cockrell's Hill, makes for a small island of settled country surrounded by wild and trackless wilderness, filled with dangerous wildlife and worse. Farther afield is the nation of Timishburg, where Professor Letchfield used to teach before retiring recently. This nation has a dark reputation, and while never confirmed nor denied, persistent rumors that the aristocracy is ruled by a caste of vampires continue to circulate like a conspiracy theory that just won't die. Before play, you should pick or invent a background for your character that gives him a connection to Professor Letchfield. Here are a few samples that you can choose from, or consult with me and invent your own. Former student. While the nature of some of his work was classified and considered dangerous, he also had a stellar reputation as a scholar for the Academy in Mittermarkt in faraway Timishburg. Many aspiring scholars schemed to find a way to work with him on one of his many academic projects, and maybe you were one of them. Former hireling. Professor Letchfield had a cadre of trusted, useful people who traveled in and out of Mittermarkt and other nearby places who used to run errands for him, dropping off suspicious packages with shady characters or picking them up and delivering them to him. Perhaps you are one such trusted associate who helped with this sketchier side of his research. Relative of former protege. When the professor was younger, he had a promising academic protege who worked closely with him and whom he treated more like a son than a student. For some unknown reason, they had a falling out and have been out of touch for some years. Perhaps you are the son or other close relative of this protege, contacted to come as part of a posthumous reconciliation of some sort. Local friend. While not a gregarious or overly friendly person, the professor had made a handful of friendships with young and promising locals who he thought had the potential to be more than rural miners or farmers. Perhaps you are one of these. Estranged in-laws. When the professor's wife died, he had a falling out with his in-laws and they have not spoken since. Perhaps you are a niece or nephew on his wife's side, come to reconcile with your cousin, or whatever the exact nature of your relationship is, Rebecca, now that he's gone. exotic contact. While it is not impossible for there to be members of any of the standard races in Cockrell's Hill or nearabouts, the professor maintained contacts with other academics throughout the land. Perhaps you come from a more exotic location to pay your respects for a colleague and correspondent who you never met in person, but thought you knew relatively well. The themes of this campaign will include horror, mystery, investigation, swashbuckling adventure, and dark fantasy. Imagine a combination of supernatural horror and fantasy with no doubt a fair bit of dry gallows humor, not unlike the Brendan Fraser Mummy movie combined with a fantasy James Bond movie in tone. This is not a pre-written campaign, so your choices will drive the direction that it goes, and elements of your character design and background are expected to play an important role. And finally, the third campaign brief, Mind Wizards of the Demon Wasteland. It is a dark age for the land of Baal Hamazi. The old empire has fallen apart, and now isolated city-states struggle to preserve a small fraction of the empire's fallen glory, while holding at bay savages, many of them descended from former slaves of the empire who have no love for the Hamazim, who infest most of the wastelands that separate the city-states from each other. Meanwhile, the native Kemlings who made up the upper caste of the old Hamazim society have abandoned their homeland in these trying times in record numbers, further weakening and diluting the remnants of the Hamazim. Most city-states have had to make compromises with the cultural principles of the past, including accommodations with the descendants of the former lower castes, or allowing large numbers of alien immigrants to settle among them. All of this you know, as you have been working for at least some months in the area. What you don't know is, where are you? What are you doing out here in the wild, surrounded by the remains of a destroyed caravan? What's the deal with the phases of the moon? It shouldn't be full unless you've somehow lost 2 weeks. The last thing you can remember, it was the 40th day of autumn, and you were in glittering Simashki, about to embark on a long trading tour east of Bucknerfeld. Now, according to the moon, it's the 55th day of autumn, and you are somehow in the gorge lands of Baal Hamazi, many miles to the west of Simashki. What happened? The game will be played using the Dark Heritage 2 M20 rules. Hardcore mode optional rules and customized races will not be used for this campaign. There are no other house rules in effect. Characters may pick any race or class from the book, and we will create level 1 characters at the first session together and then jump right in. If you don't know the rules, they're not that hard, and I can walk you through it as we play. It is expected that the first leg of the game will take place in Baal Hamazi and maybe some of the nearby areas in the desert. Both wilderness survival and travel, as well as urban intrigue and chicanery, will feature heavily. Before play, you should pick or invent a background for your character that gives him a connection to the general area. Here are a few samples that you can choose from, or consult with me and invent your own. Local. You were born and raised in the area, either in the urban center of Simashki or in the rural lands nearby. If this is your background, you are most likely 1. A Kemling, a member of the race who once proudly ruled this land, but who now see their old imperial dreams turn to dust and ash before their eyes. Many of the people have fled for greener pastures, but your family may well have decided to hold their ground. Either that, or you may be one of the many Kemlings who are somewhat embarrassed by the obvious trafficking with demons, which was the infamous hallmark of that society. 2. Alternatively, you may be a Drylander human, an ethnicity with bronze skin, brown hair, and striking silver chrome eyes. Many of them were former slaves of the Hamazim, and many lived in tribes in the wasteland, much as they did when they rebelled against the Kemlings and refused to submit to their overlordship. But many also live in the cities, and following the collapse of Baal Hamazi society, they have made a new place for themselves. 3. The Skraelings who live here never submitted to the Kemlings either, but kept a lower profile. In recent years they have come to more prominence, although exactly what their secretive shamans and witch doctors want is unclear to most, even their own people. Some of them have left their tribes, seeing opportunity in the new landscape of the area. Trader. A number of peoples trade with some of the city-states, particularly glittering Simashki at the foot of the gigantic Rudmont Escarpment, which is where you were. Few independents are allowed in by the local government, so most are associated with guilds or syndicates operated at Volok Seminak in the north, Bucknerfeld in the east, or Lomar even further east. If you are a human of a more normal ethnicity, like the Hill Country folk, or a Jan, or a Cursed, or maybe even some Woes or Orc muscle, this is most likely why you are in the area. You probably have contacts and friends in town who you've worked with through your guild or other organization that you had to join in order to operate here. Refugee. Your family is originally from Timmishburg, but you have lived here for many years. You're not sure why your family left everything behind that it had in the South, but your parents seem to have a bitter and yet fearful attitude about it, and they are prone to bouts of paranoia and looking suspiciously over their shoulders at everyone that they don't already know. You've never been able to convince them to tell you more about it, but a bit of that suspicious attitude may have rubbed off on you as well, and you have imagined any number of dark threats in the South searching for you and your family. Timashire and Tarushan humans are the obvious choices here, but Wozes, Cursed, and more can all come from this area as well. Nephilim live like this no matter where they are most of the time. If you are an even more exotic or unusual race, this may well fit your backstory too. Seeker, Elamer Kurosi. That's the Tarushan man you have been looking for. Your patron has hired you to find him, and you've tracked him to Simashki. You aren't supposed to contact him. You don't know what your patron wants him for. He just wants him located and his whereabouts reported back. In a stroke of luck, you found where he was just days before he was to embark on a journey by caravan to the east. Intending to join the caravan and keep track of him, you woke up without a clue as to what happened. He is not among the people with you or the dead bodies in the wreckage of the caravan. Any race or background could be one of these. In hiding. You fled to Simashki in disguise because you had a price on your head due to a misunderstanding with a crime boss in Isin. Afraid that you've been made, even here, you decided to stay on the move and go even further east away from the agents of your nemesis. Unfortunately, somehow you've ended up back west again. The themes of this campaign will include horror, mystery, investigation, swashbuckling adventure, and dark fantasy. Imagine a combination of supernatural horror and fantasy with no doubt a fair bit of dry gallows humor. If the Three Musketeers were combined with The Godfather, The Old West, Dracula, and the horrors of the chaos powers of the Warhammer world, you'll have a pretty good idea of the tone and theme of this campaign. Anyway, those are my 3 campaign briefs. Like I said, my intention were I to run would be to give all 3 of these to my players and let them choose which of the 3 they thought was the most interesting. And then I'd go develop it from there. I'd draw up a map that was specific to the campaign. Actually, I'm sure I'll do that before I ever get around to playing it. But I would draw up a map that was specific to the campaign, and I would start working on some potential antagonists and villains that have their own agendas that would kind of intersect with the PCs, and then we'd throw it all into the blender and see what comes out. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. I've already made this audio a little bit longer than I thought, and so I'm going to go ahead and start editing it and put some video to it, and we'll get this thing uploaded.